There are stories that are rarely told about human conflicts, stories that unfold in the shadows of great narratives, in the spaces between the lines of history books. This is one of those stories, a story about survival, adaptation, and nature's incredible ability to persist even in humanity's darkest moments. For years, as groups of people traversed the dense jungle of Vietnam, something extraordinary was happening around them. Local wildlife, from the smallest insects to the largest mammals, demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to avoid, predict, and survive the movements of human groups. This is not just a story about animals. It's a story about natural intelligence, about communication systems that science is still beginning to understand, and about how nature finds paths where we see only obstacles. Before we continue this fascinating journey, I would like to ask you to subscribe to the channel and leave in the comments the time you are watching this documentary. Your participation helps us to keep bringing incredible stories like this. Let us go back in time to a time when the forests of Vietnam were the scene of one of the most intense conflicts of the 20th century. The jungles were dense, moist, claustrophobic. Centennial trees formed a canopy so thick that sunlight barely touched the forest floor. It was a green labyrinth, a world within another world. For the people who entered, every sound was a possible threat. Every movement in the shadows could mean danger. But for the natural inhabitants of that ecosystem, that was their home millions of years ago. They knew every trail, every tree, every stream. They could read the signs the forest offered in ways no human preparation could teach. The first reports of unusual animal behavior began to appear as early as the first months of intensified human activities in the region. Experienced observers noticed strange patterns. Monkeys that normally vocalized during the day were silent hours before a group reached a certain area. Birds that inhabited the treetops abandoned their nests long before any human presence was detectable by conventional senses. Deer and wild boars that left clear traces on the forest floor suddenly disappeared completely from entire regions, as if they knew in advance that that territory would become a zone of intense activity. Initially, these observations were dismissed as coincidences or attributed to the basic escape instinct that any animal possesses. But as months turned into years, and years accumulated data, a pattern began to emerge that could not be ignored. Wildlife was not simply fleeing immediate threats. They were anticipating human movements hours, sometimes even days in advance. They were communicating across vast distances in the forest. They were creating coordinated escape routes that seemed impossible to creatures that supposedly operated on instinct alone. To understand this phenomenon, we first need to understand the unique environment that is the Vietnamese jungle. We are not talking about any kind of forest. We are talking about one of the most biodiverse and ancient ecosystems on the planet. Millions of years of evolution have created a web of life that's so intricate that each species is connected to dozens of others in ways we are still discovering. The Vietnamese forest functions as a superorganism, where information flows through channels invisible to human eyes. Different tree roots intertwine underground, creating networks of chemical communication. Fungi form connections between distant plants, transmitting danger signals and nutrients. Insects act as living messengers, carrying chemical information from one point to another in the forest. Indochina tigers, which still inhabited the most remote forests at that time, were perhaps the most impressive examples of this ability to anticipate. These majestic predators, which could weigh up to 200 pounds, moved through the jungles with a silent grace that defied their body mass. Experienced hunters knew that a tiger could be just a few feet away and you would never see or hear it unless it wanted to be detected. During the conflict, multiple reports documented tigers abandoning their usual territories weeks before areas of intense activity were established. We're not talking about random escape. We are talking about coordinated evacuations, where entire family groups of tigers moved to areas that would remain relatively quiet in the months that followed. How'd they know? This question intrigued not only observers, but also the few scientists who had access to this data. The answer began to reveal itself when researchers paid attention to the senses that animals possess and that we humans have lost throughout evolution, or perhaps never had with the same intensity. Tigers, like many other mammals, have a highly developed vomeronasal organ. This organ allows them to detect pheromones and other chemical molecules in the air with extraordinary accuracy. But not only that, tigers are also able to detect infrasonic vibrations, sounds so low that they are completely below the threshold of human hearing. These vibrations travel for miles through the ground and air, carrying information about distant events. When convoys moved through the rudimentary jungle roads, when aircraft flew over the forest, when great disturbances shook the terrain, all this generated unique vibratory signatures. And the animals learned to read those signatures. More than that, they have learned to associate certain vibration patterns with imminent danger. A tiger could sense the movement of heavy vehicles 10 miles away and make the decision to move away from that direction long before any humans in the region realized any threat. But tigers were only a small part of that story. Asian elephants, who still lived in small groups in mountainous regions, demonstrated even more impressive capabilities. Elephants are known for their exceptional intelligence, prodigious memory, and complex social ties. During the years of conflict, observers reported behaviors in elephants that seemed to defy rational explanation. There were reports of entire herds crossing rivers, something they normally avoided, to reach areas that would remain free of disturbance in the following months. There were stories of elephants leading other smaller animals out of zones that would become areas of intense activity days later. Modern science helps us understand at least some of this mystery. Elephants communicate using infrasonic sounds that can travel for tens of kilometers through the ground and air. These low-frequency calls are imperceptible to humans, but other elephants can detect them through specialized receptors on their paws and trunks. More fascinating still, recent research has shown that elephants can detect storms and other atmospheric disturbances hundreds of miles away. They literally sense changes in barometric pressure, air humidity, and electric fields that anticipate larger weather events. If they can sense a storm 300 miles away, why couldn't they feel the approach of large human movements? The primates of the region, especially the langur monkeys and gibbons, formed another crucial component of this natural warning system. Research conducted decades after the conflict revealed that primates are capable of having specific calls for different types of predators. One specific call for eagles, another for leopards, another for snakes. Each call conveys not only the presence of a danger, but detailed information about the type of threat and its approximate location. During the conflict, these primates developed new calls. Calls to aircraft, calls for large groups of humans moving through the forest, calls that differentiated between different types of human activity. And here is the truly remarkable aspect. These vocalizations were not only heard by other members of the same species. Other forest creatures have learned to interpret these alarms. Deer reacted to the monkey's warning calls. Wild pigs changed their routes based on the cries of the gibbons. The entire forest functioned as a distributed communication network, where each species was simultaneously a receiver and a transmitter of vital information. But not all communication in the forest was auditory or chemical. There was also the language of movement, the language of collective behavior. Observers noted that waterfowl in lakes and swamps near areas of intense human activity began to exhibit synchronized flight patterns hours before groups reached those areas. Hundreds or even thousands of birds took off simultaneously, creating living clouds that moved in complex formations. These patterns were not random. Later studies in collective bird behavior revealed that these formations are governed by simple mathematical rules followed by each individual, but that they result in emergent intelligence at the group level. The flock as a whole can process information and make decisions that no individual bird would be able to make alone. When a bird detects danger, it slightly changes its speed and direction. Nearby birds detect this change and react, propagating the information through the entire flyby in a matter of seconds. The result is that a group of birds can react to a distant threat almost instantly, even if only a few individuals have directly detected the danger. During the conflict, these flybys functioned as biological radar systems, detecting and announcing the approach of patrols long before humans could approach. Let's now talk about smaller, but no less important creatures in this story. Vietnamese jungle insects form a vast and incredibly diverse community. There are estimates that there are millions of insect species in Southeast Asia alone, many of which have yet to be catalogued by science. These little beings have sensory systems that seem to us like science fiction. Some moths can detect pheromones from potential mates from miles away, following chemical concentrations that reach only a few molecules per cubic meter of air. Certain ants navigate using Earth's magnetic fields and the polarization of sunlight. Dragonflies have such advanced visual systems that they can process images at speeds far superior to human ones, effectively seeing the world in slow motion. During the years of conflict, researchers noticed dramatic changes in insect populations. Certain species of ants, which typically built elaborate anthills on the forest floor, began migrating their nests to the treetops. Swarms of bees that had hives established for years suddenly completely relocated their operations. These were not gradual or random changes. They were coordinated, strategic moves that suggested some sort of prediction or detection of future danger. The key to understanding these behaviors lies in understanding how social insects process information. An individual ant has a tiny brain with perhaps 250,000 neurons. A human has about 86 billion. But an ant colony can have millions of individuals, and together they create a superorganism with computational capabilities that rival our most sophisticated computers. Each ant follows simple rules, but the interaction of millions of ants following these rules simultaneously results in complex, adaptive behaviors that emerge at the colony level. Ants communicate primarily through chemical trails, pheromones they leave while walking. When an ant finds food, it returns to the nest leaving a stronger chemical trail. Other ants detect this trail and follow it, reinforcing it further. But the interesting thing is that these chemical systems are sensitive to all kinds of environmental disturbances. Huge disturbances create pressure waves that disperse pheromones. Heavy movement of people and equipment contaminates the air with foreign odors that interfere with chemical communication. Intense ground vibrations create noise in the tactile communication system that ants use. Ants responded to these disturbances by treating affected areas as hostile and relocating their operations to more stable regions. But the fascinating thing is that they did not expect the disturbance to come. They moved in advance. Just as you can learn that dark clouds and strong wind precede a storm, ant colonies learned that certain vibration patterns, certain odors in the air, certain changes in the activity of other species preceded major disturbances. And having learned these patterns, they acted preventively. Now let's consider one of the most enigmatic creatures of the Vietnamese jungle. An animal that has become almost mythical in the stories told by soldiers who served in that region. The hazy leopard, or nebulous panther, is a medium-sized feline that lives almost exclusively in the treetops. They are so elusive that even local populations that have lived in the forest for generations rarely see them. With their fur marked by complex patterns that blend seamlessly with the filtered light and shadows of the treetops, these animals are living ghosts. During the entire period of the conflict, there were exactly 0 confirmed records of a hazy leopard being captured or found dead by groups of people crossing the forest. 0. In years of activities through millions of hectares of forest, these animals remained completely invisible. That doesn't mean they weren't there. Traces, claw marks on trees, remains of prey revealed their continued presence. But they simply were never seen. How? The answer lies in a combination of extraordinary physical adaptations and intelligent behavior. Nebulous leopards have extremely long tails that act as counterweights, allowing them to move through the treetops with agility comparable to that of primates. Their hind legs have specialized joints that allow them to descend from trees upside down, something almost no other feline can do. They can jump distances of up to 9 meters between branches, moving through the forest without ever touching the ground. But special anatomy is only part of the story. Behavior is equally important. Nebulous leopards are primarily nocturnal and crepuscular, active during dusk and dawn. These are exactly the periods when human groups were less active and less alert. These felines also have vast territories and unpredictable movement patterns. They do not visit the same places at the same times. They do not create detectable routines. Each night is different, each route varies, each decision seems almost random. This fundamental unpredictability makes them almost impossible to track or anticipate. But there was more to this story. People often reported a feeling of being observed when they were in certain parts of the forest, especially at night. a sense of invisible eyes accompanying each movement. Most of the time, these reports were attributed to the stress of the unknown environment. But on some occasions, when groups returned and revealed their photos, night vision equipment occasionally captured distinctive reflections of feline eyes in the treetops, often directly above where people had passed. The cloudy leopards were not fleeing the groups. They were watching them, learning about these intruders in their territory, assessing whether they posed a direct threat or could simply be avoided. This ability to assess threats and respond appropriately, rather than simply evading everything unknown, is a hallmark of sophisticated intelligence. And it was not exclusive to leopards. The region's porcupines, with their natural defenses of sharp spines, often completely ignored passing groups, continuing their normal foraging activities. They apparently assessed that humans carrying heavy equipment and making considerable noise posed no threat to a creature that any predator would think twice about before attacking. Snakes, on the other hand, displayed opposite behavior. The region's venomous vipers, including the dreaded Russell viper and several species of cobweed, seemed to actively avoid human concentrations. Snake bites, while always a risk in jungle environments, were surprisingly rare considering the population density of these species. The most likely explanation is that snakes, being ectothermic and dependent on external heat to regulate their body temperature, are extremely sensitive to vibrations and heat. They can detect the thermal signature of large groups of humans at considerable distances and simply move away from these heat concentrations. Interestingly, there are reports that local populations who lived in harmony with the forest for generations rarely suffered snake bites, while groups of people who were new to the region had much higher rates of encounters with poisonous snakes. This suggested that snakes could somehow differentiate between humans who had been part of the ecosystem for a long time and newcomers. The most likely explanation is not anything supernatural, but rather patterns of behavior. Places that grew up in the forest learned to read subtle signs of the presence of snakes, to avoid areas where they often hide, to move in ways that do not elicit defensive responses. They became part of the natural rhythm of the forest. Newcomers, on the other hand, moved in ways that were alien to the ecosystem. They made unexpected noises, stepped on places where wild animals would learn to avoid. This brings us to a crucial point in this story. The forest is not a silent or static place. It is constantly vibrating with information. Each creature is simultaneously transmitting and receiving signals. The challenge for any animal is to filter out all that noise and identify the signals that matter. Over millions of years of evolution, each species has developed specialized filters tuned to detect the threats and opportunities most relevant to its survival. A deer pays special attention to sounds of large predators. A bird will pay attention to the alarm calls of other birds. A frog attunes to the mating calls of its own species. When humans entered this system in large numbers, they initially represented something completely new, something for which animals had no pre-existing filters. But filters are not fixed. They can be adjusted through learning. And what we witnessed during those years was a collective learning process happening at an ecosystem scale. The forest as a whole was learning to detect, interpret, and respond to this new form of disturbance. This process was accelerated because the selective pressure was intense. Animals that could not learn to avoid danger areas were less likely to survive and reproduce. Animals that developed better detection capabilities had evolutionary advantage. In a matter of a few years, the equivalent of just a few generations for many species, adaptive behaviors have spread across populations. Puppies learned from parents. Members of social groups learned from each other. And in some cases, there is evidence that learning even occurred between different species. One of the most documented examples of this interspecies learning involves birds and land mammals. Researchers who studied audio recordings made during the conflict found that monkeys began to react to the alarm calls of certain species of birds that they normally ignored. Similarly, deer began to heed the calls of apes in a way they had not done before. What was happening was a reorganization of the forest communication network to include new types of information and new connections between species. All this paints a picture of a forest that was not a passive victim of human events, but rather an active, responsive, adaptive system. But there is another aspect of this story that needs to be explored. How did animals develop escape routes and movement corridors that seemed impossible? Documented observations often mentioned that areas that were carefully monitored, where it seemed impossible for large wildlife to escape, were still empty when people finally arrived. The animals had disappeared like ghosts. The answer lies partly in underestimating the intelligence and observing ability of animals, but also in overestimating our own ability to control and monitor vast areas of wilderness. A group of people, no matter how well prepared, still consists of humans with limited senses moving through an extremely complex environment. There are always gaps in coverage, always moments of distraction, always alternative routes that were not considered. Intelligent animals, especially those that live in social groups and can coordinate their actions, become exceptionally good at finding and exploiting these gaps. Elephants, for example, have generational knowledge of migration routes. Elderly matriarchs carry in their memories mind maps of vast territories, including water sources, feeding grounds, and escape routes that have been tested over decades or even centuries. When faced with new threats, these animals do not need to discover new routes from scratch. They simply access this ancestral mental database and select the most appropriate options. Similar reservoirs of spatial knowledge exist in many species. Wolves and wild dogs create detailed mind maps of their territories. Migratory birds navigate entire continents using multiple reference systems including magnetic fields, star positions, and visual landmarks. Salmons return to the exact streams where they were born after years in the ocean, sailing for hundreds of miles using a combination of smell and magnetoreception. If these navigational and spatial memory capabilities exist, why would it be surprising that intelligent mammals could use these skills to avoid danger areas? There's also the factor of time. Humans operate on very specific timescales. Activities have defined durations. Expeditions have schedules. Even prolonged observations eventually end because people need to rest, eat, receive supplies. But animals living in the forest operate on different timescales. They can wait. A tiger can remain completely still for hours, waiting for the perfect time to move. A crocodile can be submerged, almost invisible all day long. Birds can simply fly upward, landing on high branches where they are virtually undetectable, and wait until it is safe to descend again. This patience, combined with excellent knowledge of the terrain, created insurmountable advantage. While human groups had to move to meet goals and timelines, animals could simply hide and wait. And because they could detect the approach of humans long before humans could detect them, they always had enough time to find suitable hiding places. But perhaps the deepest aspect of this story is what it teaches us about consciousness and intelligence. For a long time, humans assumed that real intelligence, true consciousness, was our exclusivity. Animals were seen as biological automata, responding to stimuli through pre-programmed instincts, but without real understanding or abstract thinking ability. The last few decades of research in animal cognition have completely demolished this simplistic view. Crows can solve multi-step puzzles that require sequential planning. Octopuses can learn by observing other octopuses, demonstrating social learning in creatures with brains structured completely differently from ours. Dolphins have individual acoustic signatures that essentially function as names and call each other by those names. Chimpanzees form complex coalitions and remember favors and betrayals over the years. Elephants demonstrate behaviors that can only be described as mourning rituals, returning to the bones of dead relatives and gently touching them with their trunks. Vietnam's wildlife was not operating by instinct alone. I was thinking, learning, adapting, communicating. It was demonstrating forms of intelligence that we are still beginning to understand and appreciate. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: we are not as special as we like to think. Intelligence exists in many forms. Consciousness exists on many levels. And nature has found 1,000 different ways to solve the problems of survival, threat detection, and communication. Looking back, perhaps the question should not be how Vietnamese wildlife could stay one step ahead of human groups. Perhaps the question should be why we thought it would be different. These animals evolved over millions of years in environments where predators and dangers were constant. They have developed senses that we have lost or never had. They have created communication systems that work perfectly for their needs. They have built social networks and reservoirs of knowledge that are passed from generation to generation. Humans, on the other hand, were the newcomers. We were the ones who didn't know the rules, didn't speak the language, didn't understand the signs. We were, in many ways, the aliens in that environment. And like any invasive species in an established ecosystem, we were fundamentally unable to compete with native experts in their own territories. There is a necessary humility in recognizing this. A humility that should inform how we interact with the natural world. We build our cities, our technologies, our complex systems, and convince ourselves that we dominate the planet. But the truth is that there are vast areas of knowledge, vast domains of competence where other forms of life are infinitely superior to us. And maybe, just maybe, there is wisdom in recognizing these limitations. People who have spent a lot of time in those forests often talk about a feeling they carried long after returning home. A sense that the forest was conscious in some way, that she watched them, evaluated them, tolerated them, or rejected them according to criteria they could never fully understand. Many dismiss these feelings as a result of stress, but maybe there was something deeper about it. Perhaps they were, without fully realizing it, detecting the presence of this vast distributed intelligence network. Perhaps they were feeling the thousands of animal consciousnesses, all tuned into their presence, all processing information about these strange intruders. Modern science is beginning to validate some of these intuitive feelings. Recent research demonstrates that forests function as superorganisms, with trees sharing nutrients through fungal networks, warning each other about pests and diseases through aerial chemical signals. If the plants themselves are communicating and coordinating, imagine the level of complexity when we add all animal species to the system. What emerges is something that comes close to a form of collective consciousness, though not the kind we are used to recognizing. It is important to note that this collective consciousness is not directed or centralized. There is no controlling brain making decisions for the entire forest. Instead, it's emergent. It arises from the interactions of millions of individual components, each following relatively simple rules but creating complex patterns in the aggregate. It is similar to how your own brain works. Individual neurons are relatively simple cells, but billions of them connected in intricate networks create consciousness, memory, abstract thought. Vietnamese forest functioned in a similar way. Every animal, every plant, every fungus was like a neuron in a vastly distributed brain. And this collective brain has learned to recognize and respond to human disturbances with impressive efficiency. Not because there was any central plan, but because the components that best detected and responded to threats survived and passed on their strategies through learning and eventually through genes. All this raises profound philosophical questions about the nature of intelligence and consciousness. If an entire ecosystem can exhibit coordinated, adaptive behaviors that resemble intelligence, where do we draw the line? If an ant colony, with millions of individuals but no central control, can build complex architectural structures, regulate temperature and humidity, grow fungi, compete with other colonies, and make collective decisions, is that colony conscious? Is it a single entity or millions of separate entities? These are not just abstract academic issues. If we recognize that intelligence and even forms of consciousness exist at levels and forms that go beyond the human individual, we are forced to reconsider our relationships with other life forms and with entire ecosystems. We are forced to question the ethics of habitat destruction, species extinction, disruption of ancient ecological networks. The history of Vietnamese wildlife during the conflict serves as a powerful reminder of these realities. Even under extreme pressure, even with massive habitat destruction, even with human interference on unprecedented scales, the web of life has persisted. Animals have found ways to survive, adapt, continue. But that does not mean that there were no huge costs. Many species have had their populations devastated. Habitats have been fragmented in ways that took decades to recover, if they ever fully recovered. Ecological cycles were disrupted with consequences that cascaded through the entire system. Today, many of the species that demonstrated these remarkable capabilities during that time are threatened or critically endangered. Indo-Chinese tigers are rare. Asian elephants are under constant pressure from habitat loss and human-wildlife conflict. Nebulous leopards remain elusive, but their populations are declining. The irony is that the same capabilities that allowed these animals to survive one of the most intense human conflicts may not be enough to save them from the slowest and most persistent threats of habitat destruction, climate change, and ecological fragmentation. But there is hope in this story as well. If these animals were able to adapt so quickly to unprecedented threats, it demonstrates remarkable resilience. If ecosystems can learn and respond collectively, it suggests that given the right conditions, recovery is possible. And if humans were able to document, study, and begin to understand these remarkable capabilities, perhaps we can also learn to live in ways that respect and preserve these non-human intelligences. The knowledge that was gained through the study of animal behavior during this period has applications that go far beyond that specific historical context. Researchers in conservation biology use these insights to design better wildlife corridors, connecting habitat fragments in ways that allow animals to move safely. Scientists studying animal communication have built on these observations to develop deeper understanding of non-human languages. Biomedical engineers study the extraordinary senses of wild animals to develop new sensing technologies. There are also important lessons on nature reading that have been incorporated into modern survival training. People who work in natural environments are now taught to pay attention to the signs of nature. Sudden silence of birds may indicate presence of other beings nearby. Acetated behavior of animals may suggest hidden dangers. Observing wildlife routes and patterns can reveal safer paths through difficult terrain. In essence, humans learn to read the forest the same way the forest learned to read humans. But beyond all practical applications, there is value in simply marveling at the complexity and sophistication of natural life. There is value in recognizing that we share this planet with other intelligences, other forms of consciousness, other ways of experiencing and understanding the world. There is beauty in realizing that we are not alone, that we are not the only thinkers on this planet. When we look at the stars and speculate about extraterrestrial life, about alien intelligence, we often imagine being so advanced and different from us that we could barely understand them. But maybe we don't have to look that far. Perhaps we are already surrounded by alien intelligences, by forms of consciousness so different from our own that we have only begun to recognize and understand them. The mind of an octopus, with neurons distributed through its arms, each capable of processing information independently. The collective intelligence of a swarm of bees, making democratic decisions about where to establish new hives. The ecological awareness of an ancient forest, connected through underground mycelial networks. These are genuine, real forms of intelligence, but so fundamentally different from ours that they require humility and mental openness to be truly appreciated. And perhaps that is the final lesson in Vietnamese wildlife history, that the world is more complex, more interconnected, more aware than we normally recognize. That intelligence comes in many forms. What communication happens through channels that we barely begin to perceive. And that respect for other forms of life is not only a moral imperative, but also a recognition of realities that science continues to reveal. The animals in those forests were not just resources or obstacles or background for human actions. They were active agents, operative intelligences, resilient survivors navigating through extraordinary circumstances. They were always one step ahead, not by magic or luck, but through keen senses, sophisticated communication, rapid learning, and in-depth knowledge of their native environments. They were one step ahead because that was their home, and no one knows a better home than anyone who has ever lived in it. This story invites us to reconsider our assumptions about intelligence, consciousness, and our place in the natural order. It invites us to be more humble in our claims to dominance over the natural world. Because every species that gets lost is a form of extinct intelligence, a unique perspective on the universe that disappears forever, a chapter in the history of life that is erased before we can even begin to read it completely. May we learn from these lessons. May we respect the non-human intelligences that surround us. And may we work to preserve the incredible web of life that makes this planet so extraordinarily special throughout the known cosmos. Because in the end, we are all inhabitants of the same world, all products of the same long and complex evolutionary history, all connected through ties that go deeper than we normally perceive. And may the Lord God, in His infinite wisdom, grant us the grace to recognize and honor all His creation in all its wonderful complexity and beauty.